Hi, my name is Leslie Baum, and I am in my home in Chicago, Illinois. I'm going to talk a little bit about where and when painting entered my life, which was very early, extremely early. Both my parents were artistic, even though they didn't have professional practices. My mom was a school teacher before she was a full-time mom. My dad worked in technology for IBM, but my dad had a dark room and he was an amateur photographer. And I spent a lot of time as a child in that dark room helping him, air quotes, helping him, watching him, and seeing kind of the magic of those photographic images appear, which had a huge influence on me. And my mom was a hobby artist. She made pottery and watercolors, and she taught me how to draw. And all of these things I've done my whole life. I have a hobby pottery practice myself, and I've always taken pictures, but I became a painter. And I really started seriously in college and kind of fell in love with oil paint. Especially when I was studying abroad at the Glasgow School of Art, the year of 1991, 92. And it was that year that I saw examples of really serious young people as painters, which I hadn't really seen at the University of Vermont where I was in college. And I decided there and then that it's what I wanted to do with my life. But as soon as I got out of college, I did a residency at the Vermont Studio Center, where there was only a few other recent graduates. Most of the other artists there were much more mature artists and adults. And so that was a really great experience for me. I thought of it as kind of a commitment on a life in making if I did that as soon as I was done with school. Just as a sidebar, I also met some of my most dear and lifelong friends that summer of 1993 in Johnson, Vermont, the Vermont Studio Center. And upon returning to Chicago, where my parents were and where I decided I wanted to be after school, I got my first independent studio with one of the friends I met at the Vermont Studio Center, Portia Hine. And she and I shared our studio, and I embarked on a life of making painting as a 22-year-old. And I've been going ever since. So primarily oil for the bulk of my early career, but I always made watercolors as a way of thinking and a way of drawing and a way of working out ideas. It took me a long time to come to appreciate them for what they were and to accept them as works in their own right and not just preliminary processes that helped me get where I was going. And I really didn't arrive at that till maybe I'm just guessing in a timeline, but maybe like 15 years ago. And I think as a younger artist, I had drank the Kool-Aid about working big and making monumental statements. And it took me a number of years to unlearn that. I still like making big work, but I've really come to value the intimacy of small statements, small works, which has helped me to fully embrace watercolor as a primary painting medium of mine, and one that should be celebrated across the field with other artists as well. Animation, I always was interested in it and never had technical chops, and it started as a collaborative, it always has been a collaborative process and project with a dear friend of mine, Frederick Wells. And, I have to look at my website to see when we did our first one, but we've made 3 together over the course of time. I want to say the first one was well over a decade ago, and each one has gotten a little bit more sophisticated as we've learned through making. So yeah, that's a little intro to how I came to painting and oil and the role of watercolor in the beginning and as it is now.
I noticed on your website that you also did murals.
I've done a mural. I've done some very big works that are canvas, that are loose, that are attached onto the wall, but they're not actually painted. They're separate pieces. I think maybe that's what you've seen. They're monumental in size. They're raw canvas, unstretched, shaped, that I've cut and painted on the floor of my studio and then adhered directly and smoothly onto the walls of galleries and institutions where they've been exhibited. I use a lot of color. I just love color. I don't know if I have a palette. I think I am a colorist, a lover of color. I'm addicted to color. I think it's endlessly instructive and fascinating, and it's a place where one never stops learning, which is a really good place to be in life as a person and as an artist. There's been times where I've tried to like dial it back and be one of those people who works primarily in black and white with a little bit of color, or those earthy tones that were very influential when I was in Scotland. Everyone used to paint with brown, but it's just not me, I guess. I just love color too much love of color.
You mentioned Scotland. You went to Glasgow School of Arts. Can you talk about your time there?
Oh, it was extremely important. I was just there for 1 year. I did a junior year abroad, and I wasn't at an art school. I was at a university that had an art department before that and after that. And that was by choice, because I'm always been kind of intellectually curious, and I wanted to study all kinds of subjects, and I didn't want to only be making. I wanted to learn about all kinds of things. But I realized I really missed the intensity and the purposefulness and the drive of other art students being in this more liberal arts university setting. So I knew I wanted to be a painter. And at that time, that school had a very reputable and very well-regarded painting program. And I had fond connections to Scotland. Yes, I went there just for a year, and I had amazing peers and learned so much. I was a terrible painter then. I was really out of my depth, which I didn't know until I got there. The way that the school system is set up there, and I don't know if it's like this across Europe, but students began specializing in high school. So all my peers just had more technical prowess than me, because they had been focusing on their art skills since like they were 16, almost exclusively. It was humbling, which is a good thing to have happen to a person. And I really just had to work really hard and be really bad for a long time. But I was very inspired by my peers. I still think a lot about their work, and I'm still in touch with a couple of those artists who have been had really interesting and inspiring careers.
Your paintings are mostly abstract. Are we looking at emotions? Are we looking at thoughts? What are we looking at?
We're looking at different things. I mean, we're talking about, gosh, I've been painting full time since my early 20s. So it's almost 30 years of painting. So different bodies of work reflect different times of my life and different interests and different curiosities and different projects. So I can speak more concretely about a specific body of work. So for example, there's two ongoing projects that I'm involved with now. One started in late March of 2020 during lockdown, and one started in the spring of 2017. In a way, they intersect and dovetail with each other. Both projects have a watercolor component as the primary component, but also are realized in the studio on a larger scale on canvas with acrylic paint and also some oil paint. And both are invested and indebted to my direct observational encounters with the natural world. And I abstract from those experiences. So I'll start with the plein air project, which is the kind of most important project I'm involved in. That's the one that started in 2017. In that one, I go on painting, I call them painting dates. So I invite a person to go outside and plein air and paint with me. And that person does not have to be a painter, and they do not have to be a visual artist. They don't have to be an artist at all. I've painted with over 100 people. Before the pandemic, We sat side by side at a little folding table, like a camping table that I keep in the trunk of my car. And we primarily paint in and around the city of Chicago, in its parks and forest preserves, at the lakefront, in people's backyards, in gardens, things like that. We make really small, pretty humble, not that like noteworthy watercolors. And a big part of it is just being together and kind of forging connection through this different way of sharing space. But I keep everyone's watercolors. And for, I don't know how long now, at least 15 years, I have made work in my studio that samples, that references and lifts from other people's work. For a long time, it was from art historical sources. For the plein air project, I am looking to the watercolors that I paint and the people I go painting with, I call them my painting companions, paint. And I extract out little elements from those watercolors and combine them to make something new. I do this through collage originally. I scan and print out all the watercolors and cut them up and play with them in that way and make studies that I then interpret into larger paintings. So there's a process of abstracting, but it's very grounded in a real observed experience, both by myself and others. And then what I am painting is just kind of an organic or intuitive response to the relationship, to the view, to the colors, just to all of it. It's not very calculated. It's very intuitive. But I'm interested in suggesting, referencing, evoking rather than describing. That's what the plein air project. The other ongoing project I call a garden in a vase. And I had started to paint flowers from my garden during lockdown because I wasn't going to my studio. And it seemed like a good way to be in the present and be aware of the passage of time. So I would pick fresh flowers and I would paint them until they wilted, began to dry, pick a new fresh flower. And I would paint every day, at least in the beginning, 3 watercolors a day. And I was just, I didn't have any idea what this project was in the beginning. I just knew I didn't want it to look just like flowers. So I was just using the flowers as a way to see and to explore and to understand color and shape and form, all those building blocks of painting. And now it's been over 2 years of that. And I still see it as kind of like a calendar, a way of keeping time. And those have evolved and moved into the studio as well. And I'm going to do a residency in Maine at Watershed this summer. That's a ceramic residency, and I'm hoping to translate some of those into slabs, into small clay pieces.
I read one of your interviews, and during the interview, you mentioned being influenced by each of your senses: taste, sound, touch. You're very kinesthetic. Is that an accurate observation?
I think that I just try to be, I don't know, I wish I was kinesthetic. I'm kind of obsessed with that as a real experience. I don't think I have it. I think I take things in mostly through my eyes in terms of making, but I do strive to be very present and alert, which does mean attending to all my senses. But in terms of painting, for me, it's primarily visual, but I'm a big listener to people and to ambient sounds and to music for sure. And I'm a, passionate eater. I love food. But I don't know how much these things really work themselves into the paintings. I think in the plein air project they do, and it might have been in that context that this interview referenced this, where when we're out in the park or at the lakefront or wherever we are painting, I am very much trying to be present and to really listen to the person I'm painting with and the sounds of the place, but not so much to paint them in that way, just to kind of hold the experience, keep the experience. And then the painting that I make, which is whatever, it just is what happened in that moment, is a kind of like it conjures. It helps me get back to that lived experience. I think of my painting practice as an expanded painting practice. So within that, it contains multiple ways to make and to think about the objects I make and how they relate to each other and how they engage with space. And when given the opportunity to have a large space, I love to make an installation. I'm really interested in how all the objects speak to each other and are part of one larger whole. And that's one of those cases when you mentioned if I made murals, those large, unstretched, shaped paintings were installed site specifically, directly on the wall and made for those spaces. But they also contained other works like traditional small works on canvas, ceramic objects on shelves, meditation pillows that I consider paintings that are cotton ducked and painted that one sits on. And I do think of all of these works as being of a piece. Of course, they each one exist as their own and could be spun out into a different context. But for the purpose of the exhibition, the installation, they become one piece. But this is really, to me, opportunities like this are space specific. And when there isn't an opportunity to make a large installation, I'm just not fabricating one in my studio with the hopes I'm working on other stuff. And when I'm invited to be in a space like that, my tendency is to really engage with the whole space and come up with something that I can really explore all the different ways I think about painting and bring it all together inside that space.
You paint on canvas, you paint on paper, you paint on cotton. How do you decide what are you going to paint on?
It's often determined by the parameters of the project. Watercolor wants to be on paper. I got to do some really interesting embossing at a printing press here in Chicago. So that was on paper. And I got myself on bigger paper and got engaged with paper there, painting directly on these embossed pages. When I wanted to work in clay, I really thought of those flat slabs as paintings. And it was just the opportunity. Like I said, I had an exhibition where I could do this and some funding. So I expanded into clay. When I started working on wood panel, that was because they were shaped. And it was just a kind of practical thing. I wanted them to stand up and be upright like objects. And what it would take to do that in canvas and stretcher bars was just beyond me. So I was like, oh, well, these can be wood and they can be shaped and they can be freestanding. So it's very pragmatic. I often look at the terms of the space, the project, what I want to do, and then I think about what material serves it. And it's really fun to use materials one's never used before. I worked on this really odd material I would have never used that I ended up continuing with for a while called Sintra, which is basically like it's like foam board, except for instead of paper with foam in the middle, it's plastic with foam. It's typically used for signage in museums. And I was invited to make a painting on a friend's house. She uses her house as a gallery. It's called Terrain. That artist has unfortunately since passed away, but Terrain is still there. And artists would make installations on the porch, in the yard, in the windows, somewhere on the house. And I wanted to cover the facade of the house. This might have been another thing you saw that you thought of as a mural. It was actually separate paintings on this Sintra that we screwed directly into the house. So Sintra is extremely lightweight, and it's also weatherproof. And you buy it in huge sheets. And a friend of mine who's a carpenter helped me cut it down with a jigsaw. So I was able to make these giant panels and paint them and then attach them directly to the house. So again, it was the terms of the project and kind of thinking about how to realize it that opened up a material. And then I continued to paint on the scraps for another year afterwards because I had it and I learned how to paint on it. And it was really fun to use that surface moving into another exhibition.
Let's talk about your animation projects. You worked with another artist, I believe.
Yes, Frederick Wells.
How do you approach animation?
With total ignorance, which is so much fun. It's great to take on something where you know nothing, so you don't know the rules. So you just kind of do what you can do and surprise yourself and often other people in the process. So I know nothing about making animation, and nor did Fred when we first decided to start, but we wanted to work together. He's a good friend. He is primarily a musician and a programmer and a graphic designer. He has all these wonderful skills and very creative. And so we thought animation would be a great way for us to work together. And our first animation, the Nagila Breakdown, we didn't know what we were doing. And when we first started, I realized I was like, oh my gosh, you just like move around a circle on a surface and it becomes narrative. It just instantly suggests story. So we really need to accept that and maybe work with a story. So I decided I would pick a story that we would then kind of riff on. We wouldn't literally tell the story. We would use the story to help us make aesthetic and visual moves, and we could learn through doing that. So I picked not biblical, but it's a Bible tangent story. It's called the Megillah. It's a story of Esther. And I just kind of picked it kind of randomly. I was like, oh, I should pick something that kind of maybe is identity oriented. I don't know why I thought that, but I'm Jewish. And I was like, there's not a lot of stories, biblical stories with women as the lead and they exercise power, they're the hero. And I was like, this is a pretty interesting story with a woman at the lead. And it would be fun to work with it. So Fred happened to have a graphic novel. I don't remember who the artist was of it. And we kind of used that as our source. And then we just played with my watercolors and trying to figure things out and made a sound collage. And we were very happy with what we did. Even like I said, we had never done it before. And at that time, it was before like the digital cameras on phones were very good. And we borrowed someone's really fancy camera. And we had this big setup we got from the School of the Art Institute that they were getting rid of. It was like this kind of huge, chunky table with a huge, chunky, I don't know what you would call it, like a stand that you would put the camera on that could move up and down. It was a monster. That's what we made that on. And then the next animation we made, I was like, well, I picked the story, Fred. You picked the story for the next one. And he picked a book by a Nigerian author, like My Life in the Bush of Ghosts, I think is what it's called. Famous book. And his ancestry going back is Nigerian. So he was like, well, I'll pick mine. That's kind of reflecting on my identity. And the book was also the title of a Brian Eno record that was very popular. So a lot of people were familiar with the record, but maybe not the novel. And we called it Ghost TV. And so that's how that subject came to be. And again, it doesn't tell the story of the book, but we use the book as source material for images and kind of narrative moves. And now we've just completed our third animation, which is going to be exhibited at the Chicago Cultural Center in a show that I am in, a solo show that I have opening in the end of February. And that show, that animation, we decided to do things differently in all ways. The whole thing was shot on an iPhone. It's not referencing a book, and it's less literal in terms of storytelling. We're exploring trees, and it's an ongoing project. And right now it has 4 chapters. Each chapter is a vignette in one way or another about a tree. So we have a little vignette about an aspen, about a strangler fig, about a willow tree, and also about a mimosa. And we'll do more into the future. So it's pretty, it's an ever evolving process. We've definitely learned a lot more. Fred's gotten a lot more sophisticated with the software, but it's still very analog. I paint everything and draw everything, and they're all real objects that get moved around.
You mentioned technology. I know that some artists are using digital painting. How do you feel about using digital painting?
I mean, I think every tool is a tool that is open to possibilities. I'm a real say yes to anything kind of person in terms of what is art and what people can make. I happen to just love materiality. I like pushing things around in my hands. I like texture and stuff, objects. So I don't really think it's something I see myself doing, but one never knows. But I use digital tools to help me. I use a little sketch app to help me play with colors and figure things out. And before that, I used to use Photoshop to help me work out my collages. I use my camera to take pictures and futz on my pictures. So technology and all kinds of digital tools are really exciting, and different artists have different orientations, and we'll use them in the ways that suit them. But because I'm so material based, I imagine the things that will draw me and compel me and insist that I make them will remain of the material world.
You mentioned the book of Esther. Esther is probably one of the most powerful and also strongest women in the Old Testament. She managed to survive as a Jewish leader, married to a non-Jewish man, and ruling a nation that at the beginning had mixed feelings towards her. So we are back to gender and to being a woman. Women, we are still a long way to go. There's still a lot of violence against women based on who they are. How do you feel about that?
Well, I mean, it's deeply upsetting, isn't it? I mean, it's a constant source of sadness and frustration to move through a world that doesn't always see you and the group that you're associated with as being worthy, equal, a full participant, And I have really, I strive in my life, not just as an artist, to be a person who is sensitive to that, in my teaching that I do. It's really important to me to focus a lot of my examples when I'm showing other artists and what they do, to make sure that, at the bare minimum, 50% of the artists that I'm showing to students are women artists of color. I like to work with other women when I can. It's just not always an option, but I try real hard to, collaborate and work in spaces run by women curators. And I feel like with the Plein Air project, part of it is just getting to know another human, which is kind of my philosophy about how to affect change in the world. People affect change in lots of different ways. And I think we need all of the ways. We all have different skill sets, and some people hold the megaphone and rally the masses for demonstrations. Other people's with the pen, and they write passionate pleas that move and hopefully change hearts. I'm someone who tries to be in the world with each person and to hear each person and to build bridges one person at a time through getting to know someone, because it's hard to objectify someone and not value them if you know them. So that's kind of my practice. My social justice practice is trying to just be one person at a time, present, and build relationships to make a difference, on that very, very central one-on-one level. And it's become part of my painting practice by doing these painting dates and trying to paint with different kinds of people and then fold them into my work.
You mentioned in an interview that you grew up around your mother, who worked in a museum.
That's true.
And you would visit her. That was one of your first experiences with art. What would you say from those days influenced you the most?
Oh, so much. I was so lucky. I mean, I've also worked at the Art Institute here in Chicago for 25 years. So, I come from museum people. It was just magical. It was a different era for starters. And since my mom, she was working at the High Museum of Art in Atlanta. And when I first started going with her, it was the 70s, so people didn't helicopter parent. You didn't have to be chaperoned all the time. So my mom would work and I would run around the museum, and that wasn't a problem. I would have I don't know, an hour or something. And I would just imagination play by myself. And so I developed feelings for the artwork and the space, like they were my playmates. And I really think that has lingered, because before I started doing the work I'm doing now, I mentioned to you that I've long sampled, referenced, and lifted from other artworks. And I was doing that from art historical works. And, not all of them, and most of them were not, but they were, tangential to some of those early experiences. And I would joke that, I would think of Matisse or Moreau or Cezanne as being an uncle or a cousin. And I had every right to play with those works in my own work. And I don't know if I would have come to that attitude or that kind of liberal approach to other people's art if I hadn't had those intimate experiences as a child and that feeling of belonging in those spaces, which can be very off-putting. I wasn't put off, I was welcomed. So they were very seminal. We also traveled a fair amount to New York City, which has big museums, and I had a lot of family in Baltimore, Maryland, which is very close to DC, which has amazing museums. So my whole entire early childhood, I was in museums and had experiences looking at all kinds of objects within galleries. And so that has always felt very a part of me, native to me.
During this pandemic time, and also the weather was not exactly friendly, was that helpful? Did you create more, or on the contrary, it hindered your projects?
Yeah, I think it's been a really interesting time for all people, of course, and challenging time. One of the early things that I came to understand is I was extremely grateful I was an artist in the beginning, because I knew what to do with my anxiety and I knew what to do with my time. When you have a studio-based practice that's solitary and you know how to make out of experience, it gives you a path. I was never bored. I was never at sea about what to do with myself. And I was so grateful that I had those tools from a life of making. But I wasn't going to my studio in the beginning. My studio is not terribly far away, but it's about a 20-minute drive. And I was just too freaked out in the beginning just to go anywhere. So I started this Garden in a Vase series. So it ended up being very meaningful and extremely helpful, purposeful, and it ordered my life to go and pick these flowers and put them in a vase. I have lots of I love ceramics so much. I have a lot of different vases. So I would think about what vase I liked and put the flowers in, and I would try to paint 3 in a day. They're small. They're only 7 inches by 10 inches. And I did that every day for 6 or 7 months. And so I was extremely productive, but on a very intimate scale. It was a very small scale and towards not an exhibition goal. It was just towards the goal of maintaining sanity and purpose and finding something within the extreme uncertainty and challenge of those months. And then by the summer, I was back to the studio a little bit, but I really didn't know what to do with myself, because before I started painting the flowers, I was really kind of bringing the plein air project to the public. I had 2 exhibitions planned for 2020, both that got postponed. So I felt a sadness about that work, and I didn't want to look at it or think about it because I didn't know if it would reach its audience. I wasn't as, I tend to be very project oriented. So I was a little lost about how to get back into the studio. So I chose actually to mostly work at home. I still do. I have my dining room set up as my watercolor studio. And then, shows got rescheduled. The plein air show that I was working on the most is this February. Hopefully it'll still happen. One never knows. The other one should be in November of 2022. And then in between, I ended up having 2 opportunities to exhibit this Garden in a Vase work that were not planned, that totally came out of the pandemic. And I was in a really lovely online exhibition organized by LA painter in the very beginning of small scale work that people were making from home. So as hard as it was, and is full of uncertainty and real pain, I took a lot of solace out of my watercolors and having a project that had daily parameters to it.
About your teaching, are you now teaching online?
I am. I teach in person too. I have 2 primary places or ways. I'm not sure which is the best way to describe it historically, where I have taught. And both are very long, committed relationships with those places and people. And so I had worked for 25 years at the Art Institute of Chicago, and working with all different audiences in museum education, which was then named learning and public engagement. And now I'm not sure what it's called. I work with school groups and with families and with adults and teachers, all different audiences. But in the past 10 years, prior to the pandemic, I was mainly working with adults teaching drawing in the galleries directly from the artwork. And when the lockdown arrived, I was actually just about to start a new class. And I had even emailed all my students that we were going to be meeting that second week of March, and then the museum closed. And sadly, I haven't been back. And I don't know if I will, because of the way that all that has changed. There's not as much in-person programming. I think education staffs in museums across the world don't have the same role when there's not the same public. So with the encouragement and support of friends, I decided to try to interpret and translate a version of what I was doing in the museum online. And I reached out directly to people who had taken my class in the past year or 2 and tried something out. And now I'm on my 9th class. And it's been really meaningful. It's been extremely meaningful. I'm so grateful for it, and my students. And then my other teaching job is at a social service agency here in Chicago called Threshold. And we work with adults living with mental illnesses. And I run an art studio at one of their locations on the near south side of Chicago. And I have been there for almost 25 years. Many of those years working with the same artists, so very long-term relationships in that studio. And I am back in person, but there were times when I wasn't in person. and we are actually taking a hiatus. We're suspended right now because of Omicron, but hopefully I'll be back in the next week or two.
Let's talk about the mediums. You used to work with oil, and now you're working more with watercolor and
acrylic.
With acrylics. And I spoke with a few other artists, and many of those who started working with oils, over time, they switched toward different mediums, acrylics or watercolor. What made you shift to a different medium?
Well, I didn't mean to. Let's just say that. A long time ago, I wanted to shift to acrylic for health reasons because oils are just bad for your brain. You know, the chemicals are very toxic. Mineral spirits, turpentine, stand oil, varnish, Dharma varnish. These are bad. And people get brain damage from them. And the paints themselves, if you get high quality paints, which I do, are made with heavy metals, lead, cadmium, beryllium. Again, not good for you. You have to be extremely careful. You have to wear ventilators, gloves, work in ventilated places. And I wasn't doing that. So I knew that it was not wise to persist, especially since I paint thin. So I've always thinned by paint. And when I painted with oil, that meant thinning it with turpentine or mineral spirits and pouring it and letting it evaporate. Again, not awesome for your health. And I did that for most of my professional life. But I couldn't give it up because I loved the effects. What ended up changing for me, like I said to you about the surfaces or the supports I work with, that it's really dictated by the terms of the project. When I started making those large scale, very large scale, you know, some of them are 15 feet, you know, in their longest length, unstretched canvas pieces that I was mounting directly to the walls, I wasn't priming that canvas. I was painting directly on raw canvas. And first of all, that would be way too expensive with oil paint. Second of all, oil paint would eat through that, so it would not have much longevity. So I knew in order to realize this work that I was so interested in doing, I had to work in acrylic. And I'd never worked successfully in acrylic, and I had no interest in acrylic, but it was the material that would let me do the job. So I bought acrylic paint just for that purpose. And then when I went back to working smaller scale and on stretched canvases, I went back to oil, but just incrementally, I kept finding places in those paintings where I thought, oh, I could get that watercolor-like effect with acrylic much better than with oil. So I think I'll, you know, use a little bit of acrylic. And so for a couple of years, those paintings were like mostly oil with parts that were acrylic. And then when I moved to the plein air project, and I knew that the paintings that I would be making in my studio were directly translating watercolors, I thought, well, acrylic translates watercolor better than anything. It looks more like watercolor. So I shouldn't be using oil. I should be using acrylic. Again, the terms of the project dictated the material. And so those paintings that I've been making for the past 4 years are mostly acrylic. There are parts in them where I add oil because it's what the painting wants, what it needs. And now with the Garden in a Vase watercolor series, and I'm translating those onto canvas, those are all watercolors. So again, it makes sense to translate them into acrylic. So I miss oil. I never meant to stop working in oil, even though I just delineated why it's so bad for you. It's still like just a glorious medium to paint with. And actually two recent paintings I made both have elements of oil in them. So I imagine there'll be a time where it becomes more central again. But I really just follow what the project needs.
You also said something very important in your interview, that you revisit your images, your work. And I know a lot of artists who do not revisit their work, but you do. It's almost like a silent animation thing. You did it, then you go back, you revisit, then you go back, you revisit. So it's a sequence. But at the end, we see just the final painting. But the truth is, it's a sequence of paintings in there. How do you decide which work, which artwork you will revisit, and what prompts it?
It's hard to really answer that. I feel like so much of that is just intuitive, and it's influenced by factors in the moment, you know. Take an animation, for example. The animation that Fred and I have just completed, almost all, maybe not all, but like 75%, 75% of the pieces or the backgrounds that we used were things that I've made over the past 15 years. So I was just pulling out stuff from my flat files and my storage, and thinking, oh, we could put this painting down, and then I'm going to make this other stuff, and I'm going to put it on top, and that looks really good. So, and then that thing that I made 15 years ago has a whole new life. It's not the same as it was because it's in conversation with a new story, a new medium, new things that I've made. But I don't have some sort of clear cut plan. It's just like, what do I need? What's available? And I think that the key distinctive quality is that I suspect that I might want to use things again, so I hold on to them, and I'm relatively organized. But I don't always know that I will or how I will. And, you know, I'm very prolific, so I have a lot of work, and I sell stuff, but I have a lot of stuff in my studio. So if a project, while I'm working on it, in its making needs something, and I already have it made, you know, why not use it? So it's just a fluid part of making, to be folding in older works when and where it makes sense and is, you know, generative. But I don't really have a scheme or a system or a plan for how any of it works.
This year, what are you going to focus on?
Well, I'm really hopeful that these exhibitions that have long been postponed will actually happen. And I want to focus on the joy of presenting work. I've been making, which is wonderful. But there's something extremely meaningful and important about the work being shared. And not just shared like on Instagram, but like encountered in real life and encountered in a thoughtful exhibition. Like when we were talking about an installation where a person can enter it and have an experience of the whole. And so I'm just beyond hopeful that this show at the Cultural Center will happen with the animation and the plein air paintings and the plein air watercolors. And then I'll get to do another version of it in the fall at another institution. And I'm really excited to work again with clay. I haven't worked with clay in like 5 years, and very curious about this idea I have of translating shapes from the garden vase watercolors into clay. Whenever I move from one medium to a next, it always opens up new ideas that I hadn't entertained or encountered. So I'm excited for the new. And when the weather gets good, I just really want to go on more painting dates with people. I actually have a whole list of people who have expressed interest. Here in Chicago, it's just not, it's too cold and snowy to be outside. But once spring and summer arrives, I really want to get outside and paint with more people and see where this project goes. So that's as far as I have planned, but I'm deeply hopeful for all of it. And I'll be okay if it doesn't happen too. I've gotten much better with accepting change and uncertainty in this time.
Are you collaborating with galleries, or are you representing yourself?
I represent myself. I've had galleries, and just in the way that the art world has changed, specifically here in Chicago, none of the galleries I work with are still in business. And none of the galleries that are here I work with full time, although I've exhibited in many of them for specific shows. And I think as long as I get opportunities to show, which I have, and I can connect directly with people who are interested in the work, it's fine. That's what all I want is to make the work, to share the work, to show the work. And so far, I've been able to do that on my own, which has been a surprise. I was surprised that this is how it turned out at this stage in my career.
Leslie, how can people find you and how can they find your work?
I am on the internet. It turns out that if you Google my name, you just get me. Sometimes that isn't the case with people's names. But my website is lesliebaum.net. But if you can't remember that and just put Leslie Baum painter into Google and go on an image search, it'll take you straight there. I also use my Instagram account primarily for my watercolors, along with some other stuff. And that is Lepcha Mina, Lepchamina. And I will be on the Chicago Cultural Center's website and calendar upcoming. Probably they'll have the show announced in the next week or two, and it'll be up in person in Chicago for 6 months. And the Cultural Center is one of the most visited sites in the city. It's right across from Millennium Park. So if people happen to be in Chicago in the next 6 months, starting at the end of February, they'll be able to see the work.
You also wrote a few essays, a few articles. Are you writing?
I am. That comes as a huge surprise to me. I never thought of myself as a writer. I always felt kind of tortured about having to write. But in the past couple of years, I've found that it really helps to articulate in my own voice what I'm thinking about these projects. And I also have discovered the amazing value of a good editor. So I have 2 friends who are just the most gifted editors who I have been working with, and they've been really helping me become a better writer and shape my voice in words. So yeah, I've been doing, I find that when I have an exhibition, I want to make a statement. I don't want someone else to do it for me. I mean, I like having an essay written, but I also often want to get my own voice out there. So yeah, that's a thing I'm working on too. I'm striving to get better and better at it, and I would have never guessed that I would be writing. I did want to mention a few of the other people that I have worked with. I do really value collaboration. In addition to Fred, I have a somewhat ongoing collaboration with the artist Allison Wade. She works, I don't know what she would consider herself. I often call her a sculptor, but that seems too limiting. She weaves and makes things out of clay and makes installation. And much of her work is very painterly. And we have made 3 projects together. I don't know when we'll work together again, but I know that we will. I've also worked with a couple of poets indirectly in different projects. I've commissioned a poet to write a poem as an essay for an exhibition. And I've worked with another poet who wrote a poem for me for a painting that ended up being used as the didactics for a show as well. And at my last show in New York back in 2016, both of them came and we did a poetry reading, and that was really meaningful. So I hope that moving forward, there'll be more of these kinds of collaborative endeavors with different artists and writers.